Ever since the dawn of Abrahamic religions, there has been a unique attribute that only they possess. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are all unique in their own certain way, in that they are the only religions that have actively sought to convert or change their neighbors, by force if necessary. Since the ancient Israelites killing the neighboring Edomite tribe, to Islam and Christianity fighting in their constant crusades and jihads against each other, ever since they have existed, there has been friction. But, in the early 1500s, the focus of Christianity had shifted away from combating outside heathens to fighting back a new fever. The Protestant fever, started by Martin Luther, would consume Europe in bloodshed for over 100 years. A century of infighting, Christian killing Christian, families torn apart, nations shattered, in what would be known as the Great European Crisis. The England that had existed during the Renaissance is not the one that we would think of when asked about the great powers of the world. England was defeated in France in the 100 Years' War, and in the War of the Roses the nobility of England slaughtered each other until a royal heir was found. England was weak, and filled with internal issues. The population was tired of bloodshed and pointless wars on the mainland. Thus, ever since the late 1400s, England closed itself off from European affairs, and looked inward. A long period of peace rested in the British Isles, while on the mainland the fire began to kindle. The act of Martin Luther nailing his 95 complaints to the door of the Wittenberg Church became the match that would set alight Christianity. The early forms of Protestantism that began in the early 1500s were not as radical as what would be the case later, but because of the heresy, the Church began to crack down hard on all Lutheran activity. Martin Luther escaped into the more welcoming northern states of Germany, and from behind friendly walls he encouraged reform. In order to avoid total religious war in the Holy Roman Empire, the emperor conceded defeat in the courts and signed the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which allowed the free practicing of Lutheranism in the north of Germany. The peace was a success for the time, and it looked like there would be peace between Protestants and Catholics going forward. That was until the continual assassination of imperial officials in Bohemia, which led to the 30 Years' War. Compared to the modern mindset, basically every other time in history has been more religious than the present, but by the actions of the early 1500s, a new wave of religious zeal washed over the world. In prior years, it would be seen as counterproductive for Catholics and Protestants to fight. Alas, the continual scratching at the scab of peace reopened a red-hot hatred so intense that almost a third of Germany would lose their life because of it. The story you're about to hear is one of the last major religious conflicts in Europe, the story of the fires of war consuming the British Isles, the story of the English Civil War. The 30 Years' War on the mainland of Europe is ending, and peace looks on the horizon. But, underneath the surface, religious conflicts begin to boil in England. In England, ever since the days of King Henry VIII, has been generally opposed to Catholicism, as in 1534, the Church of England renounced Catholic doctrine. Although an outrage to the Pope, England was so far away from the Vatican that the Church had little power to try to stop the heresy, and allowed the Church of England to form. Although England on paper was supposed to be Anglican, much of the country was still Catholic, particularly the northern provinces and Ireland. The repression of Catholics by the Church of England would become a major spark of the upcoming war. For example, the radical elements of the Church of England, called Puritans, believed that the icons and stained glass in Catholic churches was worshipping false idols, and at times armed soldiers would storm into Catholic churches and smash any object that they deemed to be heretical. Catholics were regarded as second-class citizens, and there was a part of the monarchy that upset everyone. The Queen Consort of England, Queen Henrietta, was Catholic, and just by her existence in the royal family, the entire family was put under intense scrutiny by the public and by Parliament. Anti-Catholic fever was in full swing, and nobody, not even the Queen, was safe. The year is 1642, and King Charles I of England has ruled his kingdom for 16 long years. The days of peace are long since over, and now King Charles is raising his banner of war, as the Parliament in London has continually been at odds with the wishes of the monarchy. Time after time, the king has illegally dissolved Parliament, and Parliament has begun revoking the king's wishes and legislating on their own terms. Tensions met their breaking point when Charles escaped to London to the north, where he began to raise an army of loyal men who will cut Parliament down to size. With this action, the English Civil War had begun, and with its start, the British Isles will be baptized in fire. The Royalists rallied around the king, most of whom were Catholics and farmers, while in London, Parliament began assembling all loyal Protestants and Puritans to put an end to the king's supposed tyranny. England, who 2 months earlier was at peace, was now embroiled in a war between two diametrically opposed religious factions, a war which the average Englishman had no interest in. Although, they might not be interested in war, war was very well interested in them. The armies of the Royalist forces were commanded by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who years previously commanded English mercenaries in the 30 Years' War, making him a seasoned veteran commander. However, although the leadership of the war was experienced, many of the soldiers were not. The English army was so ill-equipped due to years of underfunding that many soldiers in England had little to no armor, and supply lines were non-existent. Musket technology, although a new development, was becoming large-scale at this time period, and for the first time in history, most soldiers had guns of one form or another. There was no real institution in place to feed soldiers, thus almost all the rations of the army were taken from civilians. One way or another, all the pieces were in place for a catastrophe. All it took was a spark to light the powder keg. In late October, King Charles began his march southwards, towards London, to reassert his power. The first major action of the English Civil War occurred on the 23rd of October, 1642, near the small town of Edgehill. The battle started in the early morning, with the Royalist cannons opening fire towards the Parliamentarian forces. The cavalry of the two sides began movements, and Prince Rupert had led his men into the wall of blades. Musketry was quick to put down much of the fighting, and the battle was over rather quickly. Neither side was willing to commit their entire force to the engagement, and the battle was inconclusive. Neither the King's nor Parliament's forces were too particularly wounded by the battle, but the Parliamentarians under the command of General Essex were forced to escape from the area, further allowing King Charles to march his men to London. In the following days, the outer forces of the scouts and cavalrymen fought in the dense forests for each other, but eventually it became clear that this was, for a time, a Royalist victory. Throughout the winter, small skirmishes and battles were fought all around the English countryside. Small towns were converted into fortresses, farms were raided and burned to the ground, and food was scarce. The long winter of 1642 did nothing to chill down the fighting. This was simultaneously a war of movement and of static defense. Cities, regardless of their allegiance, were pillaged for any scrap of food and weapon that could be found. Horsemen roamed the countryside, ambushing civilians in caravans, and prisoners were treated worse than animals, and sent off to slavery in the Americas or Venice. The brutality that Britain had avoided in the 30 Years' War had come to the Isles, and by grace of God it wouldn't end until every town and city knew the wrath of a hungry soldier. Lines blurred, and to the innocent among the population there was no difference between the Parliamentarians and the Royalists. All were equally desperate for victory. The year of 1643 was no better, and as the spring brought with it a new wave of savagery. The army of King Charles was successfully able to travel most of their way towards London, but stopped once they reached the city of Oxford. At Oxford, the king's forces constructed a fortress of walls and barricades around the city, and burned and pillaged the surrounding countryside to deprive the Parliamentarian forces of resupplying there, in essence, making the entire region a dead zone. In the north, another victory for the king was found outside the village of Adwalton, where over 1,000 enemies of the king were captured with next to no losses sustained for the Royalists. By June 1643, things were looking well for King Charles, as time and time again his army found victory, and with London only being a hop, skip, and a jump away, Parliament began to panic. A dark cloud was over London, and the spectre of invasion was more than most people could bear to handle. And by the middle of the year, a massive renewed effort was made to equip and raise a new host of soldiers. This new model army, raised by Parliament, was a force to be reckoned with, and the outdated Royalist army had nothing to compare. The second half of 1643 was a disaster for the monarchy, and little could be done to reverse the course. The Royalists were given heavy defeat in Gloucestershire, Newbury, Winceby, and all Royalist forces in Ireland surrendered after a peace settlement. The king's army was now in shambles, but the war was not over. Renewed calls to arms rattled the British Isles, and by the thousands men flocked to the colours to try to save the monarchy. But, with the winter approaching once more, large-scale maneuvers ceased, and general banditry on both sides began. If I were to have a bell ring every time a town or city gets raided or pillaged here, then this entire video would just be a continuous ringing, and thus from this point onwards just assume that every location stated has been devastated unless stated otherwise. Like most prolonged wars of the early modern era, there is usually an advance in general technological growth, as everyone gambling at a game called war wants to hedge their bets and take whatever means necessary to win. At the start of the war, most men were armed with mostly pitchforks and cracked old hunting muskets. By this point, the armories had cranked out so much in volume in terms of firearms and armor that it had become standard issue for most men to have a rifle now. However, even with the entire personal wealth of the royal family at work, the royal army was under-equipped compared to the parliamentarians. In Scotland, among the Foggy Hills, a similar movement to the radical Protestantism in the south was growing. These so-called Covenanters formed the northmost spearhead to Parliament's army, and in coordination they began to advance. On July 4th, 1644, the Scottish descended from the Highlands and swamped the Royalists in a surprise attack, taking thousands of men prisoner and seizing large amounts of equipment. The king had to abandon the north, and with time, piece by piece, his land was forfeited to the Protestant alliance, leaving him with only pockets of land still loyal. The year that follows is relatively quiet, as the parliamentarian forces muster their men and prepare the next year's campaign. The winter, ushering in 1645, was the usual barbarism of limited Renaissance warfare. Famine began to consume areas of the country due to the constant near depopulation of some villages, and with famine, disease always follows. By this point it was obvious to all powers that be that this war needs to end. On June 14th, 1645, near the small village of Naseby, King Charles was completely defeated, as nearly 6,000 of his 7,000 men were captured or killed. The king had given up the fight, and in secret he escaped north into Scotland in order to go into hiding. The king and his entourage were quickly apprehended without a fight, and he was swiftly carried away to London to negotiate whether he likes it or not. The London that the king returned to was much different than the one that he knew. Parliament had lost what little democratic tradition it had once held, and by this point it had become a dictatorship. Throughout the war with the king, a parliamentary official named Oliver Cromwell took up the sword and led his troops on the campaigns. Cromwell, through his constant victories, had amassed more and more influence in the southern government, and at this point it was a suicidal act to oppose Parliament's will. This democratic institution had morphed itself into a religious dictatorship. With the king at the mercy of Parliament, one would think that some kind of peace could be found, but resistant to the advances, Charles refused every settlement for peace. Even after being public enemy number one for years, King Charles was treated graciously and was accommodated with luxuries, games, and feasts, and his family. Remember, according to the Anglican faith, the position of monarch is not just a political institution, but a religious position as well. The theory of divine right was still popular, and the royal heads of Europe were chosen directly by God's will. To harm or kill a monarch was a tacit denial of faith, as it in essence meant that it would mean that God had chosen wrong. On the ground, the situation for the average soldier was dreadful. Parliament had spent almost all of its money on requisitioning arms, and for years they had been unable to pay the army, always giving promises that would be broken. In combination with this, a scheme was brewing in the mind of King Charles. Even being held captive, he was plotting against his enemies, and with the help of a few secretly loyal servants, he was able to send letters outside of his castle. The king came into contact with the nobility in Scotland, and he vowed to them that if they were to successfully overthrow Cromwell's dictatorship, Scotland would be given special rights and privileges, and free religious practice under the Empire. Seeing weakness in revolutionary England, the Scots switched sides, and declared favour for the king. This act started the second phase of the English Civil War. In February 1648, tens of thousands of soldiers in support of the monarchy took to the streets in order to cause confusion in Parliament's army, spreading them thin across Britain. In the provinces of Wales, Kent, Essex, and Cornwall, all loyal Catholics took up the banner at once, in hopes to stop the tyrannies committed against them. Parliamentarian soldiers treated the uprisings with such ferocity that curfews were imposed on all rebellious provinces, with the punishment being death to leave the house after sunset. Blood poured down the streets, and by this point, this was no longer a war for politics. This was a war for extinction. In Wales, parliamentarian soldiers mutinied due to continually being ignored and unpaid, forcing even more men away from the main roads. In conjunction with this, the Scots had begun to march south once more, this time with their sights set on London. The poorly equipped Scottish armies charged southwards, stretching their supply lines thin in an effort to catch Cromwell's forces by surprise. Like lightning, a plaid mass stormed down the countryside, consuming every morsel of food in sight. The Scottish army was constructed of mainly Highland clans that inhabit the high north, and due to the nature of Scottish society, Constant bickering and quarrels happened between the leaders of the army. In contrast, the experienced army of Parliament had devised new methods of communication, allowing the navy to communicate with the mainland at long distances, using flags as signals. The Parliamentarian navy sailed along the coastline, following and harassing the Scottish army, revealing its location at all times. An important aspect of warfare that has mostly been forgotten in modern times is the collecting of knowledge about enemy armies is near impossible at the best of times here, and the so-called fog of war made planning a guessing game, as it was difficult to ascertain the movements of enemy armies. The only outlet for scouting at this time was cavalry and ships, and the Scots had neither, making their entire advance shot in the dark for their safety. This will be the Scots' demise. On the 17th of August, the Scots were intercepted, and Cromwell garrisoned his troops in the small city of Preston and waited for them to arrive. The Scots had no idea they were being set up for an ambush, and their army was in small foraging bands along the fields gathering supplies. Cromwell's cavalry made short work of the unprepared Scottish, and many Scots surrendered without firing a shot. Little resistance the Scots could muster was met with fire and sword, and the complete defeat of the Scottish army outside the town of Preston was the final nail in the coffin for the king to be free. With his conspiracy failed, his armies gone, his supporters silenced, and all the information about the king's letters to the Scots coming to light, thus began the trial to end the Civil War. King Charles was moved from his comfortable dwellings that had been given to him and placed in London, and was forbade to leave his room under the threat of death. The trial against him began in January 1649, and the room was tense as he took the stand. Continually throughout the trial, the king upheld his status as the sovereign of the nation, and continually questioned on what authority Parliament has to judge a king, his crimes, as stated by Parliament. Guilty of all the treasons, murders, rapings, burnings, spoils, desolations, and damages and mischief to this nation, acted and committed in said wars, and occasioned thereby. Parliament was throwing the book at him, blaming the entire war, and all 300,000 dead, as a direct result of the king's actions. The whirlwind of war had taken almost the lives of 10% of the British Isles. The only retribution, as told by Cromwell, would be paid in royal blood. The king remained very silent, believing up until the last second that Parliament had no legal right to detain or sentence him. The king firmly held that his position as monarch was given to him directly by God. To disregard the king was tantamount to blasphemy. Parliament was not convinced. In reality, the king had no way of winning the trial. He was surrounded by foes on all sides, who wished nothing more than to see his head roll, divine right be forgotten. The king was found guilty of all charges, both real and imaginary, and he was sentenced to death by beheading by axe. His Majesty's execution was on the 30th of January, 1649, leaving his family on earth to depart into the great unknown. The killing of King Charles did nothing to relieve the tensions in the British Isles, and for years afterwards, war would continue to plague the country. With a temporary halt on the monarchy, Oliver Cromwell took upon himself the opportunity, and in 1653 he declared himself Lord Protector of the British Isles, a title that was king in all but name. And under his leadership, Britain would become more and more totalitarian against dissenters of his regime. Cromwell invaded Ireland, breaking the peace treaty that existed, and violently put down all monarchist or Catholic resistance wherever he found it. All land owned by Catholics and by the Catholic Church in Ireland was seized and redistributed to Protestant settlers who came to try to replace the native Irish. Soldiers under Cromwell's command slaughtered thousands of innocent civilians in Ireland, and these became the events that would be the start of the Catholic hatred towards Protestantism that has existed in Ireland ever since, and to a point still exists today. One of the few acts of mercy that Parliament had given was the safety to the remainder of the royal family. Queen Henrietta and the children were safe, locked away in London under house arrest. But the heir to the throne, Charles II, was evacuated to the Netherlands to live with his family's cousins, far away from the grasp of the new model army. The young King Charles II spent his teenage years in exile, waiting for one day to return to England to reassert his family as the monarchy of England. In the middle months of 1650, the day came for him to try to put an end to Cromwell's dictatorship. The pact that had been agreed upon in secret with the old king was still in effect, and the Scots were still greatly displeased by the actions of Cromwell's parliament. So on the 23rd of June, 1650, the young King Charles II landed on British soil for the first time in years. The third phase of the English Civil War began when the Kingdom of Scotland declared independence from Cromwell's dictatorship, and immediately they set to work retaking the capital of Scotland away from parliamentarian forces. The Siege of Edinburgh was the first time that the young Charles had led his soldiers on the field, and it showed. Charles was unable to hold his position for long, and he lacked heavy weaponry such as cannons, making a siege nearly impossible. Charles II had decided to try to reposition his mixed army away from Edinburgh after a failed siege, but by this point, disease and starvation had racked his army, making it nearly worthless. Hearing news of the frailty of the Scottish army, Cromwell went on the offensive, and in a near repeat of what had happened at Preston, the Parliamentarian army had ambushed the Scots, taking almost the entire uprising as prisoners after their surrender. This was the death of the royalist resistance in the north, and the entire royal army scattered or captured. Young Charles had escaped, hiding in safe houses and sleeping in trees at night until he was able to stow away on a ship going to France. The young King Charles, who had only been active for a year or so, was once again forced to escape England to the European continent, leaving behind his people for a second time. Eventually, the Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell's health had deteriorated, and soon death was upon the man who had single-handedly overthrew the monarchy of a major country and created in his image a Protestant dictatorship. Years of desolation and killings had passed, and by the late months of 1658, Cromwell's health had completely turned sour. After complaining about increasingly sharp pains in his sides, the man who stopped an empire became bedridden and unable to stand. On September 3rd, 1658, Cromwell died rather anticlimactically of an infected urinary tract, leaving his eldest son the title of Lord Protector. Old Oliver was buried in a simple wooden coffin, depriving himself of the lavish burial that would be common of nobility. The son of Cromwell, the young Lord Richard, became Protector of Britain after the aristocratic diet of noble families confirmed his ascension, and they were hoping that Richard would be the genius that his father was. Unfortunately, like most notable people, their children are mediocre compared to their parents, and Richard Cromwell was totally unprepared to lead his army. Because of Richard's ineptitude, the parliamentary army fell into disarray and infighting, and the complete bankruptcy of the British Empire by this war led to poor young Richard to lose his power quickly. His reign as Lord Protector barely lasted 200 days, and with time the royalist army was able to defeat the once impossible titan of Cromwell's army. With time, the monarchy was restored after the collapse of Parliament's influence, and the young King Charles II returned to his country in shambles. Charles II began to right the wrongs that had been done to his family, and the traitors of Parliament were either executed or imprisoned for life, in an attempt to avenge his murdered father. No single person is to blame for the events that led to this catastrophe, but this did not stop the acts of revenge, thus concluding the English Civil War after 9 long years of hatred. If we were to learn anything from this today, we should remember, all it takes is one act of hatred to be remembered for all of history, and the people of Britain had still not yet forgotten the horrors, but with time, even these scars will fade.